40 years is potentially the difference between the kind of, what we saw with the mechanization of agriculture, which was more of a smooth transition, versus something much more cataclysmic. Do you think there's a reasonable argument that we may be overstating how quickly this is going to happen?
The reason why the time frame does not strike me as crucial a variable is that it's crystal clear to me, 100% clear, that we are not actually using our time to push ourselves in the right direction down this curve. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like, hey, we have all these Herculean efforts to reform our education system and like the mass retraining of these people, and if you just give us another 5 to 10 years, everything will be copacetic. We're actually doing none of those things. Most of what we're doing is praying to the market god, saying, oh, invisible hand, like move the people from that town to Seattle where they can find new jobs, and then ignoring it. I mean, that's really what we're doing. And if you look at the numbers, interstate migration rates in the United States are at multi-decade lows right now. Business formation rates, multi-decade lows in 80% of the country. Business formation rates, intergenerational lows among young people. So if you looked at it and said, okay, all of these incredible adjustments are taking place, and if we just have a slightly longer time frame, then we will cohere and get through this. I'd be like, yeah, I buy that if we're actually using our time in any of those ways. But it turns out we're doing none of those things, and we're just putting our blind confidence and faith in the all-seeing, all-knowing market to mind our society. And what I say to people is like, look, the market is excellent at doing what the market is designed to do. But the market is not designed to help unemployed cashiers or fast food workers or accountants or truck drivers. I've run businesses and organizations. I know what's beneficial to businesses and organizations, and it is not finding new jobs for 100,000 people that you just automated away. That's not what's going to help my organization succeed. So the market is going to be excellent at pushing us in a particular direction, and we just have to acknowledge that that direction is going to leave many Americans behind.
Okay,
and then do something about it.
I'm putting a check next to scare the heck out of everybody. I think we've done that. Now I think let's talk about the solution, the main plank of your platform, UBI or the Freedom Dividend, which tests better.
Yes. Americans like freedom.
Right? Who doesn't like freedom? And dividends. Dividends sounds good too. Let's start with the history of UBI, which is fascinating. This is, sometimes the next big idea is not in fact a new idea.
Yeah, universal basic income has been around for generations, where Thomas Paine championed at the beginning of the country, called it the citizen's dividend. Martin Luther King fought for it in the 60s, called it the guaranteed minimum income for all Americans, and it is what he was fighting for when he was assassinated in 68. I had the privilege of sitting down with Martin Luther King's son in Atlanta after the last debate, and he said this was Dad's vision. And I said, you just called Martin Luther King Dad. And that makes sense because you are Martin Luther King III. All right, continuing. 1,000 economists endorsed it in the 60s. It passed the US House of Representatives in 1971 under Nixon. It was called the Family Assistance Plan. And one state has had a dividend in place for almost 40 years, where now everyone in Alaska gets between $1,000 and $2,000 in oil money every year. And what I'm saying to the American people is what oil is to Alaska, data, artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles, the Internet of Things, technology is to the American people. We can generate enough value broadly and quickly enough that we can actually have a dividend for all of us based upon data and technology.
So you're proposing $1,000 a month for everyone, and I've been talking to a lot of people in the last couple of weeks about this, and pretty consistently, nobody says they wouldn't like $1,000 a month, but some people say, well, I'd also like a hot tub Cadillac, which by the way is a real thing. It's there's some forward-looking residents of Los Angeles that built a drivable hot tub. But the point being that there are a lot of people who say, of course I like $1,000 a month, but it just doesn't feel feasible, right? I think a lot of people have this sense that my gosh, we spent all this time worrying about, our deficits and, how could this possibly be something that can actually happen? What do you say to those people?
We're already the richest and most advanced economy in the history of the world. We're at 21 trillion in GDP and counting. And most of the money that we're going to put into our people's hands will actually go right back into the economy towards daycare expenses and car repairs they've been putting off and local organizations. And that this trickle-up economy will actually be enormously generative. It will create hundreds of thousands of new jobs, at least tens of thousands of new businesses, save us hundreds of billions on things like incarceration and emergency room healthcare and homelessness services, improve our human capital. It was a prison guard in New Hampshire told me that we should pay people to stay out of jail because we spend so much when they wind up in jail. And this was a corrections officer. I mean, he was retiring, so at this point he didn't care. But there was one study that said that if you were to adopt this sort of plan, you would increase the size of our economy by $700 billion a year just on the basis of better health and education outcomes for our people. And Rufus, you and I both run organizations. One of the things I say is like, look, there are three things you can do for a person in your organization. Number one, you do nothing, and then they leave you. Number two, you tell them how great they are, and that works for a little while, and then they leave you. Number three, you compensate them and you give them like a raise, and then they may stay with you forever. And so at this point in American life, we're saying to people, you're important, you're valuable, you can vote. And then a lot of Americans are like, I can vote. It's like that somehow that doesn't seem like it's really making the big difference, especially because our feedback mechanism is so broken in terms of our electoral politics. So you put this money into our hands, the value stays right in our communities. I make a bunch of comparisons, a couple. Number one, does anyone here remember voting on the $4 trillion bailout of Wall Street? No. Does anyone remember anyone looking around being like, where are we gonna get the money? No. So on this one, we're looking at a significantly smaller amount of money, particularly if you have this mechanism where we get our fair share of every Amazon sale and Google search and Facebook ad. What does a slice of AI end up meaning in terms of tax revenue? That could be an enormous number. That could be trillions of dollars in value. There are a few ways out of various situations, and your preferred way out is to grow your way out if you're an organization. The problem right now is that AI is going to displace a lot of American workers, and we're not going to see a dime of that value because the AI is going to be in the hands of the Amazons and Facebooks and Googles, trillion-dollar companies that literally pay zero or near zero in taxes. So the more work that their software and AI does, we're not going to see any of it. If you change that, then you can easily start being able to afford something like the Freedom Dividend, particularly because we get the value back over and over again. The last thing I'll say about this is, have you ever heard a company issue a dividend and then be concerned about how the shareholders are going to spend it? Have you ever heard Verizon be like, we're going to issue this dividend, but we just want to make sure you spend it on the right things? Of course not. It's like, Verizon shareholders, your money. So if we are truly a democracy where the owners and stakeholders of this country, we can afford it, it's your money, you'll do something great with it, and that's actually, in many ways, the most efficient use of resources.
So let's take through... Let's tick through some of the nuts and bolts of this for those who are not familiar. So this applies to everyone between 18 and 64.
It actually is now 18 until expiration.
Oh, okay, 18 to expiration, okay. But you choose either your Social Security benefits or the Freedom Dividend.
Social Security it stacks on top of, and I've been prevailed upon this because one, Social Security is inadequate to actually fund like any kind of decent retirement. So you have millions of seniors who are in position to essentially just work until the day they die. Two, Social Security benefits often are lower for women who took time off to raise kids, because then you have this missing chunk of your work history, and then Social Security is lower. Number three, you need to try and have resources in place to have the effective care of aging baby boomers, and right now that those economic resources are not in place in a meaningful way. So you do have to make a choice if you are receiving cash and cash-like benefits from certain government programs, but Social Security benefits are not one of those programs.
Okay, so it goes throughout your life, but it does, my 14-year-old son sitting in front would be disappointed to hear it does not kick in until you're 18. So,
yeah, but then you get that financial literacy class, your senior in high school, and be like, what are you going to do with this dividend when you get it? One of the other things I've learned over my career, it's impossible to teach financial literacy to someone who has no money.
Right.
So this would not replace Social Security, but it would, if somebody is receiving disability benefits, they have to choose.
Yeah, that's right. I would want to try and bolster the resources available to people who are disabled or special needs or unable to work, but we need a separate way to do so.
And it costs $1.5 trillion a year. And how do we pay for it? You want to walk through the VAT and how do we pay for it?
Sure. So if you look around the world, a lot of countries have looked up and said, hey, it's unacceptable for $1 trillion company like Amazon to pay zero in taxes. So what they've done is they've had a value-added tax in place, which then gives you a toll from every Amazon sale and Facebook ad, et cetera. And the great thing about a value-added tax, one, it'll generate a lot of money in an economy like America's because there's so much value flowing. But you can also ramp it up a little bit on things like yachts and luxury watches, and then you can ratchet it down or even exempt things like diapers and toilet paper and milk. If you had even a mild value-added tax in our economy, it would generate $800 billion a year minimum and rising quickly, because anytime you have some new innovation, then it would add to that. So that gets you down to, so the headline cost of this thing is actually closer to something like 2.4 trillion. So then post value added tax, it gets you down to the 1.5 or so, Rufus.
I see.
But the beauty of it is then you get an additional 400 or 500 billion back in new economic growth, because the money would flow through your businesses and create about 8 to 10% of growth in the economy. And then you save several hundred billion on your emergency room healthcare and incarceration and homelessness services that we're spending up to $1 trillion on now. And then you make your people better educated, healthier, mentally healthier, more productive, better decision makers. It's kind of amazing. So that what I referred to before when I talked about companies and organizations, how many of you all in the room have been through like a corporate training where they sent you someplace for like a week and they said, hey, we're gonna try and whip you into shape? And if you went through a training anything like mine, part of you were like, this was not an efficient use of time. But then part of you was like, well, I actually did get at least something out of at least some elements of the training. And one thing you definitely got out of it was the sense that the company was actually trying to invest in you in some way, because they were willing to have you do something that was so clearly not actually productive like for that week or so. So this is in many ways an investment in our own human capital, where we try and nickel and dime our people and say we're going to save money on you, but again we end up paying the price in much, much higher, more expensive, and also much more dark and punitive ways if someone hits any of our institutions. Because if you have a kid who doesn't succeed in school or whatnot, the kid doesn't disappear. You know, the kid winds up in our homelessness services, or like in worst case, in one of our prisons. And so if you can invest in our people, you can actually end up saving us a lot of money on the back end and increase the size of the pie.
And the value-added tax would be, I think you said before, a European average is something like 20%. You have in mind more like 10%, is that right?
Yeah, I'd set a scale of 10 and then again ratchet it up on certain luxury goods and then down on consumer staples. So 800 billion is based on 10%.
And you've anticipated my next question, which is about the criticism that the value-added tax is regressive because people with less money spend a higher percentage of their income and consequently get hit harder. And your solution to that is to adjust it based on perhaps food doesn't get taxed, for instance.
Well, that's one element, but the main element is we're actually going to put the money into your hands. And so if you get $12,000 a year, you have to consume an awful lot for like some mild price increase to eat up $12,000 a year. Rufus, you probably do it.
Once I get my hot tub Cadillac,
Yeah, that's right. It's like one hot tub Cadillac,
yeah,
then you might be a net payer.
10% VAT on that. That's gonna hurt.
But it's not regressive for 90% plus of Americans who'd actually see their purchasing power rise, not fall.
The exception would be people who were receiving disability, let's say of $1,200 a month, and consequently turned down the Freedom Dividend. Those people might get, hit by the value-added tax, plus potentially any kind of inflationary impact of the Freedom Dividend.
Yeah, that's why we would need to bolster some of those programs independently. But when I talked to someone who is on disability, she was afraid to even volunteer in her community because she was afraid she'd be identified as able-bodied and lose her disability payments. There are a lot of very negative incentives attached to some of these programs as they currently exist. When I talk to people who are recipients under these programs, a lot of them live in fear all the time that they're going to lose the benefits. And so the money is one part of it, but the structure is another equally important part.
So I'm hitting you now with a number of the biggest objections that I've encountered and thought about. What do you think, when you think about it? I mean, obviously there's no silver bullet, there's no perfect solution. We know there are always some negative unintended consequences or things we didn't anticipate. When you think about what unintended negative consequences we might see from a Freedom Dividend, what do you worry about?
I think that it's going to successfully get the boot off of people's throats and enable us all to more meaningfully participate in society. To the extent I worry about something, it really is like a translation from certain, frankly, low-order problems that many Americans are struggling with right now, just making ends meet. The human condition is fundamental. It's like if we solve these problems, there will be new problems for us to solve. I'm excited for us to try and solve certain higher order problems, like around structure, purpose, fulfillment, and meaning, and try and make meaningful progress on something like climate change. But to me, if there's a concern I have, it's that we end up making right now, we're almost making too much of material success, and then really the new struggles will take a different form, but they'll be equally important. I'm not someone who thinks that this is just gonna all of a sudden make us all happy, joyous, get along 100% of the time.
One of the things that I find appealing about the Freedom Dividend is that it's, and I think something that's misunderstood by some of the critics, is that there's an implicit humility about saying, you know what, the government's actually not very good at solving a bunch of our social problems. And there's a sort of pessimism about the government's ability to solve some of these problems, which you'd often find on the right side of the aisle. But at the same time, there's an optimism about people's ability to solve their own problems, right? And somehow, to me, that mix of pessimism about sort of institutional solutions and optimism about the capacity of regular individuals to solve their own problems feels right to me. And I realize that as I say that, I am letting drop my veil of impartiality and showing you that I actually am a supporter of this universal basic income.
I love the word humility, Rufus, because I agree with you. It's that too often a politician will stand up and say, I'm going to fix education. And you're like, oh, I'd love for you to fix education. But then you're like, wait, in practice, there are tens, hundreds of thousands of different school districts with different school boards, and you can do some things, but you're not going to be able to transform the experience for millions of American kids. There are a lot of things that we can talk about, but if we say collectively together, we want a dividend as a right of citizenship, we can actually make this happen for real. There is nothing stopping us from actually sending checks to people or wire transfers or what have you. We already do it with millions of, it was a friend of mine, Andy Stern, who actually inspired this run in many ways. He said the government is not great at a lot of things, but it is exceptional at sending large numbers of checks to large numbers of people, promptly and reliably. And so we can lean into one of the few core competencies that Americans will agree that our government has.
I was talking before about unexpected or unintended negative consequences. To me, one of the most exciting things about UBI are the unexpected positive consequences.
Yes, I could agree more.
I think people really haven't thought through. I think a lot of the sort of skeptics haven't really thought through it. And one of my favorite things, data points that points to this, is you talk in the book about how actually when people are submitted to some kind of financial stress before taking an IQ test, it has the impact of dropping their IQ by 13 points or 1 standard deviation, which is kind of astounding. But if you just think about the impact of, you have half the country living with unable to make a $500 payment, the impact of relieving that anxiety, giving people all this sort of extra confidence and competency. And I think there could be a lot of surprises about what we would see, but they shouldn't be surprises because this has been tested in many places, right? There have been a lot of places where, in various forms, like Alaska and in other countries where this has been tested. What do we know from those UBI case studies about what people actually do and what the positive consequences are and negative?
I want to return to your point because it's so fun and true. Imagine if you were to increase the collective IQ of America by 13 points or 1 standard deviation. What would result from that? We can do that. If enough of us just get together and say, okay, we understand that tens of millions of us have this economic boot on our throats and we're gonna get it off. We're gonna be able to look at your child and say, you have value, you're an American, your future is assured. This is something we can make happen. It was a literal rock star who said to me, Andrew, after you pass the Freedom Dividend, we're gonna get a new Beatles every year. Because you just imagine this wellspring of creativity that would result if you had more Americans actually engaged in particular pursuits. I love entrepreneurs. How many of you are entrepreneurs in the room? I get that sense. You have that look about you, I'm kidding. In a positive way. It's a very entrepreneurial looking group. Where if you can imagine the catalyst to entrepreneurship and creativity and problem solving and risk taking that would result from the Freedom Dividend. And you would also tackle very different kinds of problems because right now so much of our energy is around market-oriented problems. And the fact is those problems will reward a certain type of pursuit. To me, one of the biggest opportunities we have is if you can imagine women and people of color all of a sudden having higher levels of resources throughout the community, addressing problems that right now the market does not care about. Like that could be such an enormous improvement to our way of life. Having seen what I've seen, I'm now convinced that women entrepreneurs are the biggest untapped resource in our society. And I can imagine many more women starting not just companies, but organizations that would help solve the real problems of our time. And I would say to the women in the room right now, first off, hats off to you for, in my mind, participating in this incredibly uneven landscape that is geared against you at every turn. Honestly, we have this crazy sexist / misogynist, certainly marketplace economy, and I know women entrepreneurs who've made it work within this, and I know what kind of hell they had to go through. It's just ridiculous, and if we can try and balance that in any kind of meaningful way, it would be so enormous. There's no other way to do it except by something like I'm proposing. If you're a woman and you've been fighting it out in some of these, frankly, anti-women corporate environments or operating in an anti-women marketplace, and then you say, hey, treat us like not shit. Honestly. And then they're like, oh yeah, we really should treat you like not shit. But then the entire framework of the market economy is geared against you. There is no way to rework that except to get to the top and actually rewrite the rules of the economy from the top down. And it's going to take a lot of people getting together and seeing that this vision can be achievable. But to me, rewriting it so that women have an actual chance to participate in more equal ways, it's not going to happen if you continue to follow the marketplace to its natural ends, because the marketplace does not care about something like gender equity, just like it doesn't care about displaced cashiers and truck drivers. This has to be a social decision, and there's no way to make a social decision stick and work except through government, and that pains me to say as a sentence. But there is no other way. I'm sort of like an accidental politician, But I've looked at these problems and concluded that the market is going to work against us increasingly, and there is no other path except to take hold of our government and rewrite the rules.
I love the dichotomy of how when you ask people how they would spend an extra $1,000 a month, they say, well, I would, I think I take some more e-courses and I do this and I do that. And then, what do you think of UBI? Well, I'm really worried that people wouldn't spend the money well. And it's like,
You know another commonality with this, Rufus? It's like, hey, you worried about automating the automating way of jobs? It's like, oh yeah, I'm worried about it. It can happen to your job? No. It doesn't matter what their job is. You're like, you do realize you're like, you do realize you're an Uber driver now. It's the same. It's just human nature, man. It's like, of course, you'll do great things with it, but like, what about those other people? Like, I guess it's the way we think.
For my family's been going up to the mountains of Maine for many generations, and there's a town up there that has been hit in the way that all these towns in these areas have been hit. And there's a guy who runs the local Texaco station, and it's got to be the nicest guy in the world. And I always think when I go by to get some gas, it's got to be tough for him. And if you look under the little crack in his garage, you see this garden of metal, extraordinary sculptures made out of scrap metal, out of car parts. Right? They're like ostriches and flowers and clowns on bicycles. And I asked him if I could see it, and he opened it up for me, and it's literally like this beautiful garden made out of scrap metal. And I thought, how little I know, living in New York City, of all the creative energy that exists in people around the country. And it makes me feel like there are scrap metal gardens all across this country waiting to blossom.
And that belongs in a Manhattan art gallery. No, I'm kidding. Joke.
Well, and that's it. Actually, though, through Etsy or whatever, right, with a little extra funding, right,
Yeah,
Ron could upload some photos and generate some extra revenue, probably. Right?
I agree with you completely. Like, we're excluding a lot of creativity and industry out there. And to your question earlier, Rufus, when people have gotten money, I looked at every single incidents when people started getting this kind of money, and the findings were staggeringly consistent, no matter where you were, where consistently mental health improved, relationships improved, stress levels went down, hospital visits go down. If you had a kid, the kid graduated from high school at higher levels, but their personalities even changed to become more conscientious and agreeable, which as a parent myself, you can sort of imagine happening in a household where things start to make sense, and like good behaviors actually correspond to good things happening, as opposed to having no relationship, which unfortunately is the case in a lot of American homes. So the results are so consistent over and over again that I thought, and they were actually consistent with what you'd kind of imagine would happen. Like if you put money into people's hands, good things happen. One of the things that my campaign's been doing, I'm very proud to say, is we've given $1,000 a month to maybe 14 or 15 families around the country, in part so that you can take what's an abstract argument and then humanize it. So if you're in New Hampshire, which I've spent a lot of time in New Hampshire, but if you're in New Hampshire and you hear about this $1,000 a month, you're like, oh wow, like that's interesting, or it'll never happen or whatever. But then you're just like, hey, look at the Fassey family. They live in Goffstown. They get $1,000 a month. What do they do with it? They repaired their cars. They took a little bit extra time after the dad lost his job. And then you realize how ridiculous it is to think that $1,000 a month is going to hurt you. You know what I mean? It's like, well, it didn't hurt them. Wouldn't hurt you. It's like, it's actually kind of awesome. And so seeing it in real life myself over the last number of months has only affirmed what every study has shown, that it's really good for humanity.
So Andrew, we have 5 to 10 minutes based on the flexibility of your team to talk about human-centered capitalism and data as a property right, which I know is something that's of interest. Tell us about data as a property right.
A study just came out that said that our data is now worth more than oil. How many of you got your data check in the mail last month? We laugh. Where did the data checks go if it's so valuable? Amazon, Facebook, Google, and the rest of the major tech companies that have been using our data for years. And I agreed to it just like you all did. Like none of us actually read the I agree and consent form. You just clicked on it and then hoped for the best. And it seemed like it was free. So you're like, how bad could this be? It's free. And it turns out that there are hidden costs associated with it. You could say they're the economic costs because now they're profiting to the tune of tens of billions of dollars and we're not participating, which you could say we should participate, and we should, and I will make that happen as president. But number two, which is even more pernicious potentially, is that we think we're human beings with full agency and decision making, but these tech companies in some ways know us better than our best friends and family members, and they can be sending messages to us like a whole string of digital breadcrumbs, and then you make a decision, or let's say a vote at a certain point, and you think that that was your choice, but actually if you play it out over a population of tens of millions, it could be that an entire cohort or generation of us has been sent out in a particular direction by forces that we see as operating in our behalf, but perhaps are not. So there's an economic argument, there's a fairness argument, there's also a fundamental human agency argument for us being able to own our own data. So I'm proposing as president, look, we can loan our data to these tech companies, but they have to tell us what they're doing with it. They certainly have to tell us if it gets sold or resold or gets hacked in some way. If they generate economic value, then we deserve a share of that. And we have to have the ability to turn it off if we so desire. And so that's going to be the privacy, data as a property right set of rights that I champion as president.
So effectively, Facebook and Google would say, thank you for the permission you have granted us to store your data, which you own, and we will pay you $27.30 a month for
depending upon what we make of it.
Whatever.
We'll pay you like a slice of it. We might not even know what we're going to make from it this year, but whatever we make, you're going to get 30%, let's say. And the way it would work for us, most of us in real life, is that nothing would really happen or change, frankly, because none of us are geeky enough where we'd go through the data audit. You just want to know that they're not abusing it in some way, and that you can check on the audit if you want, and that the government's actually providing you some degree of parity. Because right now we have essentially zero bargaining power with these tech companies. The most fundamental thing as a parent is that our kids are getting mesmerized by these screens to a point where it's actually damaging their emotional and mental well-being. We're seeing record high levels of depression and anxiety among teenagers, teenage girls in particular. And a friend of mine, Tristan Harris, said it best. He said, we have some of the smartest engineers in our country turning supercomputers into dopamine delivery devices and slot machines for teenagers. They get paid millions of dollars to do so. So if you're a parent, again, you're outgunned. And the society will be like, what, you're a parent, like figure it out, do your job, parent. And then meanwhile, you're like, you kidding? When like this freaking kid gets out there and they have the screen, other kids have the screen, feel like you have no choice but for them to have a screen because they can't participate in society or social interactions. And then the biggest hypocrisy is when I'm like, hey, stop using your screen. They're like, hey, Dad, you're using a screen. And I'm like, so I am. So again, we have to balance things out because we're outgunned by the tech companies. We have to make it so it's a fair fight.
And another part of your solution is to apply a value-added tax to digital ads to, as you say on your website, hasten a shift away from ad-driven business models.
You'd love this, Rufus. I mean, Rufus has run several successful media companies. For those of you, you all know. All right.
By the way, we're subscription-driven. We're not ad-supported. So
that's the piece of information I was looking for.
Battle.com is ad-supported. We're subscription-driven, but I'm intrigued. I mean, because that does seem like a very kind of proactive, big government kind of solution to the problem.
I am very concerned, as a lot of Americans are, about the fact that once again the almighty marketplace is guiding the information that we get. Where in the old days you might have had a local newspaper and it wrote articles about what's going on in your community. Local newspaper's gone, replaced by these media companies that are rewarded by having more engaging, somewhat sensationalist content that you click on to higher degrees. You see it most clearly in our cable news networks, where you have Fox is like, hey, if we gin this up, like we'll make more money. And it turns out that people like the content more if it's not even trying to be objective. And the same, unfortunately, I will say, is true in a different variant on the left. And so you end up with a more polarized society because the information we consume is more polarizing because that's what the market incentives drive towards. Like if I wrote some even-handed long-form article, like, hey, that doesn't get you as much money as the clickbait, so you lose. The question is, how can the government actually start trying to moderate some of the financial incentives that drive us in particular directions? And I would say that trying to balance out the ad-driven advertising revenue model for a lot of these media companies would at least be a step in that direction.
So I've heard you say that the future markets recently show you have an 8% probability of winning the primary, and sports teams win with 8% probabilities every weekend. So that's pretty impressive. I think you're not the only supporter of underdogs. I think a lot of people in this room have an instinctive support for underdogs. This is it's been so great having you on this on our Next Big Idea podcast. The final question I would ask is, if something goes horribly wrong and for totally irrational reasons you are not elected president, which would be very confusing.
Oh, thanks, Rufus.
What do you think the probability is that we figure this out?
What I say to people is, I'm going to be a parent and a patriot, win or lose. The problems aren't going away. I'm not going away. So I'll be doing everything I can to solve them, whether it's as your president or in some other capacity, because we have to get our arms around these problems as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Andrew.